Hey, we are in week 3 of our Odyssey Remix series. And today, I want to talk about a story in the Odyssey that maybe you are familiar with. And soon we're going to get to 1 Kings chapter 3. So if you have your Bibles, you can flip there. And before we go to 1 Kings, I want to talk a little bit about the Odyssey and how this sermon came about. If you're new, if you need a reminder, we're in this series pulling some of the themes and ideas from the Odyssey because this epic movie is coming out. I actually, for the first time, just saw the picture for the upcoming movie right here at Look. So they're beginning to advertise it, I think beginning of July. When I heard it was coming out, I said, hey, this material would make for a great sermon series. Pull some of the themes from the movie, where we also find these themes in the Bible so that we can talk about how all of this applies to you, your life, and your pursuit of following Jesus. Now, today, our sermon is titled The Cyclops, Wisdom versus Ego. If you've been with us for a while, we have spoken about wisdom at great lengths at Awaken. And I kind of pulled a whole bunch of these different ideas from previous year's sermons. And I'll get into that here in a moment because this idea of wisdom is something that continues to fascinate me. And I'll talk a little bit about how that journey, that understanding has evolved for me over the years and kind of where I land with the Bible and wisdom in a few moments. But first, let's talk about how this sermon originated. If you are unfamiliar with the story of the Odyssey, and remember, we're totally cool with Odyssey spoilers because it's been around 3,000 years. If you haven't gotten around to it yet, chances are you're probably waiting for the movie anyway. Here's a few spoilers. Odysseus and his crew, they land on an island. They become trapped in the cave of the Cyclops, the one-eyed man-eating giant. They are trapped in this cave, and then the Cyclops knows that he has some victims in his home, in his lair, so he rolls a giant boulder, and this is a gigantic man, so he has such strength. He rolls this boulder to the front of this cave to ensure that his victims cannot escape. Now, Odysseus understands that he's not strong enough on his own. Even him and his men aren't strong enough to remove this boulder. So they're going to have to be creative in how they escape from this giant. Unfortunately, not everyone makes it out alive. The Cyclops is hungry. He eats some of Odysseus's shipmates. But then Odysseus has an idea. He has a plan. Earlier in his journey, he was gifted with some very strong wine. And instead of mixing that wine with water as he was told to do because it was quite potent, he decides, I'm going to give this to the giant. He gives the Cyclops some of this wine, and you know what happens if you have too many bottles of wine. This is what happens to the Cyclops. He starts having a conversation with Odysseus. He asks him, hey, what's your name? I at least want to know the name of my victim and who it is here in the cave. Odysseus creatively says, my name is Nobody. The giant, the Cyclops, laughs. He passes out. Odysseus grabs a wooden stake. He plunges it into the eye, blinding the Cyclops. The Cyclops screams out, obviously, because he's been blinded and he's in pain. He starts yelling for all the other giants around to hear, nobody is hurting me. So everyone else is like, well, this guy, like, what is he doing? He definitely had too much wine to drink. No one comes running to his rescue because he just keeps yelling out, nobody is hurting me. Please come and help me. Nobody is hurting me. Then Odysseus knows that there's no way they can just walk out of this cave after the Cyclops pushes the boulder away. So he comes up with a very wise plan, quite creative, quite ingenious. A picture of it. He decides that he is going to strap himself and his men to the bottom of the sheep that the Cyclops has within his cave. Because as they pass through, so the Cyclops, remember, brute force, strength to push that boulder aside. He lets his sheep get out in the morning so they can wander around. Well, Odysseus says the only way we're going to escape, because of course he's going to fumble around and feel who it is leaving the cave, is to attach ourselves to the underbellies of these sheep. What happens is in the morning, he rolls the boulder away. He feels the sheep going by. Odysseus and his men are able to escape because they are ingeniously attached to the bottom of the sheep. He uses great wisdom to escape in order to make it out alive with some of his other shipmates. Finally, they make it to the boat, and we have another drawing for us. They make it to the boat, and the Cyclops he's upset. You tricked me. You fooled me. He starts picking up boulders, throwing them at the ship. They keep missing the ship. But then Odysseus, who is acting in great wisdom, he has a slip up. He allows his ego to get in the way. Here's how the conversation goes. I, Odysseus, called back with another burst of anger. Cyclops, if any man on the face of the earth should ask you, who blinded you, shamed you so, say Odysseus. He reveals his name. Here's one of the other details of the story. The Cyclops is the son of Poseidon. If anyone says to you, who blinded you? Who should your wrath be poured out on? Who should you pray to your father to punish for this? Odysseus. Ego, anger, reactivity trumps wisdom here in this story. Say Odysseus, raider of cities, he gouged out your eye. Then the Cyclops cries out, hear me, Poseidon, god of the sea blue mane who rocks the earth. If I really am your son and you claim to be my father, come, grant that Odysseus, raider of cities, Laertes' son, who makes his home in Ithaca, never reaches home. Or if he's fated to see his people again and reach his well-built house in his own native country, let him come home late. Let him come home a broken man, all shipmates lost, alone in a stranger ship, and let him find a world of pain at home. What do you think happens next? Poseidon hears his son, the Cyclops, crying out, punishes Odysseus, sweeps him further away from home. All of this because of Odysseus's ego. If he had continued to be led by wisdom, chances are he would have found his way home earlier. All the subsequent travels could have been avoided if he had allowed wisdom to win out. You ever experience this in life where your reactivity or your ego, arrogance, pride gets in the way and you find yourself traveling further and further away from the place where you really want to be? You desire to follow Jesus with your life, but then there's that voice within. There's some of that arrogance or pride that you know better and you're going to walk your own path. And so you find yourself actually further afield from the direction that you truly want to go. See, this story in the Odyssey, it's about the power of wisdom coupled with the danger of ego. And truthfully, we see this all throughout the Bible. It actually begins very, very early on in the story. Now, a couple of years back, I came across this book. I've mentioned this one before. I've mentioned this author before. How the Bible Actually Works by Peter Enns. Subtitle, amazing subtitle, in which I explain how an ancient, ambiguous, and diverse book leads us to wisdom rather than answers and why that's great news. I mean, that subtitle, that just sells the book. What he talks about, obviously in the book, is wisdom and how the number one thing that God desires to give you, lead you into, is wisdom. If you think about the Bible, why do we read the Bible? Well, yes, we want to hear how God has interacted with humanity before. We want to hear the stories of those who have come before us, but we read the Bible because we want our lives to be transformed. We want to have an encounter with the Spirit, the resurrected Christ. We want to hear from the Spirit to know how it is that we should organize and live our lives. What do we want from the Bible? Well, we want wisdom. We look to the Bible because we desire to hear from the Spirit, so we have wisdom to live a life that is honoring God, a life that brings us peace, that brings joy. I mean, that's why you all read the Bible. It's why you go back to it time and time again. It's why we talk about the Bible every single Sunday, because we believe that there is wisdom there for us in our lives today. If you just memorize stories and memorize verses, those can be helpful, and they have helped many people when you find yourself in a particular situation. You memorize a verse, you think about it, it helps you get through. What you're looking for, though, is the wisdom of that which you are memorizing. You don't want to memorize verses just to appear holy, just to feel righteous. You want to go back to Scripture again and again because you want wisdom that the Spirit can offer for your life. When I read this book, it transformed my whole understanding of the Bible. If you were with me in the beginning, and I've talked about this before, but if you were with me in the beginning, I really thought that being a pastor meant that I gave people a whole bunch of ideas about what to believe. Now, as I've been doing this journey for about 20 plus years, I'm learning that that can't be the whole thing, and that there has to be some wisdom that's being imparted. Rather than just ideas about faith and about God, you want the transformation and the wisdom that comes from what you read in the Bible. And so I read this book and realized, wow, the whole thing truly is about wisdom. Now, last year, we had a 4-week sermon series on King Solomon. Maybe you remember this one of my favorite series that we did last year. As I was preparing for this series, I came across some commentary from some of the early church fathers that helped put into perspective some of Solomon's story and some of the earlier parts and how they actually related, how Solomon's story related to the very, very beginning of Scripture. Let's look at this story in King Solomon's life. Maybe you remember it. Maybe this is new for you. Here we are, 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon has a dream, and in the dream, God says, "Tell me, Solomon, your king, what is it that you desire? Let me grant you the desires of your heart. What is it that you desire more than anything else?" Well, how does Solomon answer? "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." Another way we could say this, distinguish between good and evil. What is Solomon asking for? Well, I want knowledge of right and wrong. I want knowledge of good and evil because I want to govern well these great people of yours. Now, the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said, "Since you've asked for this, since you've asked for wisdom, knowledge of right and wrong, good and evil, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment, wisdom in administering justice, I will do what it is that you have asked. I'll give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. I will make you wise above every other human." What this story communicates, what it tells us, the wisdom of this story is, wisdom is to be our highest pursuit. Wisdom is the path of spiritual growth. As we grow in our own spirituality, wisdom is, we could say, the tool for how it is that we grow and how we move forward in our faith. What the story also communicates is that the thing that God desires to grant you is wisdom. How it's termed in the story, a wise and discerning heart, so that you can live a life that is God-honoring, a life that follows Jesus, a life that blesses the world around you. But let's pause the story for a second here, because if you read this, knowledge of right and wrong, good and evil, seems to be a good thing here in Kings, but what about earlier in the story of the Bible? Who remembers this story? There's a garden. Adam and Eve are in a garden. They are told, you can have any fruit here in the garden, but you cannot partake of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So in the Solomon story, the pursuit of discernment, of wisdom, knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong, it's a good thing. But in the story that came before, it appears to be off limits for humanity. So what exactly is happening in the story? I was studying Solomon, wanted to talk about his wisdom. Obviously, it's a big part of who he is and what we know about him. I came across some commentary from some of the early church fathers, the people who, in the very, very beginning of the faith, were trying to make sense of everything. They were writing books. They were talking about what it meant to follow Jesus. And one of the ideas that I came across, which was absolutely mind-blowing and reframed everything for me with the Solomon story, but also for the story in the garden, what these church fathers said is that the knowledge of good and evil, it's actually always been the goal. Wisdom, a discerning heart, it's the thing that God has always, from the very, very beginning, desired to grant humanity, but only with the proper growth and maturity, with the proper foundation. What this story in the beginning is saying is that there is no shortcut to wisdom. There is no shortcut to spiritual growth. Sometimes we would like to be 10 steps ahead of where we are, but in reality, you can't get to step 10 without going through steps 1 through 9 first and then getting to 10. And we could say that Adam and Eve, in their arrogance, in their pride, their ego, desired to be at the end before journeying through those first couple of steps. Now, for me, when I read this, it changed the entire story for me. Think about this. If you have a child, and that child is, I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, so let's just say you have kids, they're 9 and 6, or maybe you've raised kids. Are you going to give a 9 or 6-year-old the keys to your car? That is not wise. But what if the child becomes 12 and says, well, I've ridden bumper cars, I've been on a go-kart, I've played a video game, or I've learned to drive a little bit here, I've had a steering wheel, and they approach you as the parent and say, I've had some experience, can I have the keys to your car? I'm just going to go down the street to the grocery store. Hey, I'll buy anything that you want. Are you going to hand the keys over? No. No one in their right mind would hand the keys over to a 12-year-old. And even once they turn 16 and they get their learner's permit, are you going to hand the keys over right in that moment? You're probably going to practice a little bit. You're going to go in an empty parking lot, and then you're going to take some back streets. You're not going to get right on the Sawmill Parkway. You're going to have some practice before you officially hand the keys over to your child. And then eventually, as they go through the testing and they've had more practice, eventually they can go out on their own. But in the beginning, you're going to kind of hold their hand through the whole journey. You know where the thing is going. You want them to have the freedom to be able to take the car out whenever they so desire, whenever they have to go somewhere, but you don't get to that point without all the other steps that happen before that. Same with a stove. Are you going to allow your 5-year-old to work the stove without you present? Chances are you're not going to do that. You're going to teach them how the stove works, the dangers of the stove, so eventually they can go and prepare their own meal. But that doesn't happen overnight. You are going to be there with them to make sure that they learn how to use this equipment. What about these? Would you hand a 7-year-old one of these? Some of you probably shouldn't even own one of these. There's things about these phones that are great. And there's things about these phones that are quite dangerous and have and continue to do great harm to our children and even to us as adults. There's wisdom in knowing how to use this tool properly, and there's wisdom in knowing certain ways to avoid using this tool. Wisdom takes growth, maturity. You're not just handed a phone when you're 7 years old and say, hey, all the boundaries, there's none. You're going to provide some boundaries and some limits for children. It's like riding a bike with training wheels. This is how you learn to ride a bike. Or what about guardrails? Guardrails are important when you are driving to make sure that you don't fall off the road. Guardrails, as we are growing, as we are maturing, as we're moving forward in our human journey, we all need guardrails as well to show us, hey, here's the lane. And this is the lane that you stay in. And there's actually some danger if you were to veer off and go down that cliff over here. So let me provide some guardrails for you as you're growing and as you are maturing. So when we get to this story, essentially what we see is God establishing some boundaries, some guardrails, some training wheels, a learner's permit where an adult is still present in order to show, hey, this is the path to life. This is the path to peace. And unfortunately, we all know people who didn't have that proper guidance growing up. And unfortunately, they had to learn the hard way about what life looks like when you veer off the path. Having someone with you, present with you, showing you the true path and providing boundaries and guardrails, as much as our kids rail against those and say, I don't need them, they're actually really healthy. And they are important for our growth. So maybe when we look at this story, maybe it's a test. It's a test for the first humans. Will humanity, will Adam and Eve trust God's way of moving in the world? Or will humanity, Adam and Eve, trust or create their own way of moving in the world? And the truth is, we come across this test every single day. This wasn't a one-time test in the past, but rather this is a choice that we face pretty much at every single moment. Will we trust the path that God is leading us down, or will we make our own way in the world? Will our ego, our anger, our reactivity, as it did with Odysseus, will it win out and cause us pain and cause those around us pain and hardship as well? Let's talk about Joseph. When I was in seminary, my professor said something that I had never considered before. He said, the story of Joseph, it's an ancient wisdom story. Never looked at it through that lens before. But now as I've learned to read the Bible through the lens of wisdom, and as he taught about the story through the lens of wisdom, I've come to discover that the story of Joseph, it's actually pretty much the same story as Genesis 2. And it's actually the story that gets repeated again and again and again in Scripture. If we know anything about Joseph, he is the favored son. He has a whole bunch of brothers. He's the favored son, and his father hands him this coat and says, you are my favorite son, which, I mean, man, if you have brothers and sisters and your parent favors you above the other siblings, you know it's not going to end well for you. You know that's going to provide some rivalry. So he's given this coat essentially as a reminder, like, hey, I'm our father's favorite son. And every single day that he wears that coat, which probably every single day, all of his siblings are reminded that they are not the favored ones. Then Joseph starts having these dreams. He had a dream. He told it to his brothers. And you know what? They already hated him, but then they hated him even more because he tells them this dream. Joseph is not enacting wisdom. Watch this. Here's the dream. Hey, everyone, gather around. Let me wear my coat. Let me put this on to remind you first that I'm the favored son. And then let me tell you a story. Let me tell you about this dream that I had. We were all binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Is this going to win the favor of your brothers? No. Do you think this was wise to communicate the dream to them? No. Now his brothers said, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him even more than they already did because of his dream and what he had said. Now, if you know the story, this dream gets interpreted a little bit differently later, but this is the immaturity of Joseph at this stage in his life, where he's looking at this dream and he's thinking, I mean, that's what happens when you're 12 and you're 13, 18. I mean, he probably would have been about 17 at the time. If you're 17, I mean, just think about it. He's been given a brand new Ferrari. His brothers are given like Camrys, like used 15-year-old Camrys, and he has a Ferrari. What's that? It is a good car, but they're used. They're like 20 years old used. I have no problem with a Camry. I love Camrys. If you have a Camry, please, I'll take your car. And he's like gathering them around and he's saying, you guys, you're all going to honor me. You're all going to bow down to me. I'm the one in charge of all of you. I mean, that's how he's interpreting the dream. But then watch this, because it gets even worse. He had another dream. He didn't learn from the first time, because he gathers all of his brothers around and he says, hey guys, I had another dream. Which, if you're one of his brothers, how are you going to respond at this point? Really? He had another one of those dreams, or he's just going to rub it in even further? He told it to them, hey, listen, I had another dream. This time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Everyone, again, was bowing down to me. 17-year-old arrogance. Well, that can only last so long. And when you're in high school, if you keep doing this to all your brothers, what happens to Joseph? He's beaten up. He's thrown into a hole, and he is sold to slavers who take him down to Egypt, where he has a crazy story. You can read about it, Genesis 39. Crazy story. Eventually, he's thrown into prison. But God isn't done with him yet. And that's how it works for all of us. Our arrogance sometimes puts us in the hole. It puts us in the well. We think we're better, we get prideful, we get arrogant, ego-driven as Joseph, as Odysseus, and we find ourselves at the bottom. But the truth is, your story isn't over. Even though we didn't enact wisdom in that moment, God still desires to work through you. So Pharaoh, the one in charge of Egypt, he has a dream. And he's heard about Joseph. He's heard that Joseph can interpret dreams. So Pharaoh says, he says, hey, bring the man up here. Bring him here. I want to talk with him. He says, I had a dream. No one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Here's how Joseph responds. He's been humbled. He's been broken. He didn't respond with, yeah, I'm your man. Let me have my coat back and let's get back to business here. I can totally tell you what's going on here, because me and God, yeah, I hear from him and I know, and I can tell you exactly. None of that. All the arrogance, all the ego has been removed. Listen to this response. I can't do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer that he desires. Joseph has grown in wisdom. He was given power. Those dreams symbolize his future and what eventually will happen, and how he will actually rescue his family and his people. But he was looking at it through the lens of arrogance, his own self-importance. So God had granted him this power and a vision, but he thought it was simply for his benefit. And then after he's been humbled, after he's been broken, the true wisdom is able to seep into his soul, because he's finally listening. And he's grown in his maturity. And he realizes that the power that he's been given, the gifts that he's been given, not simply for himself, but rather for the benefit, the blessing of all people. What Joseph has learned is that his wisdom wasn't solely for his benefit, but for the blessing of others. God desires, number one, to give all of us wisdom as we listen, as we open our hearts. But that wisdom isn't so that we can grow our stock account. It's not so that we can keep scaling the ladder ourselves and getting higher and higher and looking down on everyone else and saying, look at how far up I have traveled, all you down there. But rather, the wisdom that God desires to grant every single one of us is so that we can bless the world around us. I mean, think about Genesis 2. They rashly, arrogantly grab for that fruit, something that's out of the boundaries. They're exiled, they're removed. But then God says, your story isn't over. I'm still with you. Joseph, in his arrogance, thinks he's on the top. He gets exiled. He gets removed to Egypt. But then God redeems his story. The Israelites, they're in their land, but then in their arrogance, they think the land is to benefit themselves, and they forget the poor, they forget the foreigner, they forget the stranger. God removes them from the land, but their story isn't over, and they're returned to the land. It's the path of growth, of maturity, of wisdom. And unfortunately, it often seems as if growth happens when we're broken. We have to be humbled. We have to have the arrogance, the ego removed from us to see the true purpose of our giftings and our God-given wisdom. I've learned this one in life. I would like to say too many times, and I think I'm done with it, but I feel like you take one step and then it's as if the floor falls out again, but every single moment is an opportunity to learn and to mature and to grow deeper as we open ourselves up to what we're experiencing. Joseph could have said, you know what? I'm going to get my revenge on all those who hurt me. But he had grown and he had matured and he moved beyond that reactivity and said, I'm not going to get even. I'm not going to get revenge. I'm going to actually bless those who have done harm to me. Now in the Bible, here we have the greatest example. Anyone want to guess? This is the normal, typical Sunday school answer. So who is the greatest example of wisdom in the Bible? Jesus. I told you it was a Sunday school answer. Every single answer in Sunday school, well, who is it? It's always Jesus. Yeah, Jesus is the greatest example of wisdom in the Bible. It's as if this is where the whole Bible had been pointing all along. 1 Corinthians, it's because of him, because of God, that you, followers of Jesus, are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us, what's that word? Wisdom from God. In the Old Testament, wisdom is personified. Wisdom was present with God at creation. It was through wisdom that God created all things that you see. Now in the New Testament, the personification of wisdom takes on the form of a human in Jesus. Christ is wisdom. Jesus embodies wisdom. The New Testament, the New Testament writers all basically said Jesus is the true embodiment of wisdom. Let's talk about love for a moment. We can talk about love as an idea. And if someone were to ask you, if you're married here this morning, if someone were to ask you, why do you love your spouse? Or think about your family, think about the friends, the people that you love. If someone were to say, why do you love that particular person? Are you going to just start listing ideas? Well, I love them because it just makes sense. And you're going to talk about all the synapses in your brain and biologically all the things that are happening in your head that makes you actually love that person. No, that's just an idea. You would start talking about certain stories, experiences that you've had. Maybe if you have kids, you'd be like, you know what? I just looked at my kid and I was like, who is that alien? Because they look really weird in the beginning. But yet so many of you, I mean, I know for me, like you look at that kid the first time they're put in your arms and you fall in love and you can't explain it. You rationally can't prove it. You can't write it down. It's just an emotion. It's something within you. Love, generosity, forgiveness as an idea, like, all right, but once you begin to embody those characteristics and those qualities and those attributes, that's the thing that God is looking for. And what we see in Jesus is God putting on flesh, embodying true love and true generosity. You can hear God is love, and as an idea, okay, but then you hear about Jesus and how God didn't just confine love to an idea, but God embodied love, and love came down to this earth to show us true wisdom and the way of true life. So when we talk about at Awaken creating followers of Jesus, what we are talking about is following true wisdom. and then embodying that wisdom. So a few questions for us to wrap it up this morning. Here's the question that we are being offered, because remember, this test is ongoing, and this test wasn't a one-time event. And so the choice that is always before us is, will I trust the path of Christ? Will I trust the path of true wisdom? Or will I forge a path of my own wisdom? In every moment, this is the choice before us. Will I use my wisdom and gifts for the blessing of this world? Or will I use my wisdom and gifts to further myself and feed my ego? Odysseus, he did okay, and then he chose wrong. He allowed his ego to win out. He became reactive. The invitation for us, the invitation that Christ leads us into, that true wisdom leads us into, is to be a person of non-reactivity. Because when we react, that's when our pride and arrogance and ego gets in the way. And so the invitation is to pause and to be silent and to listen. So whenever you're faced with a difficult choice, rather than just having a knee-jerk reaction, the invitation is to bring it before God and to be silent and to listen and to ask, what is the wisdom for me here in this moment? What is the true path that I am being invited to walk down?